The snowstorm hit Millbrook like a frozen fist, turning Christmas Eve into a battlefield of ice and wind. Jake's pickup truck crawled through the blizzard, headlights cutting through the white chaos as 8-year-old Tommy slept against the passenger door. That's when Jake saw her, a figure in white, crumpled on the roadside like a broken angel. She should have been dead. The temperature was dropping to -15, and she'd been lying there God knows how long. But when Jake carried her to his truck, her lips moved, whispering something that made his blood freeze. The contract. They can't know I'm here. He adjusted the rearview mirror and spoke quietly to her unconscious form. I don't know who you are, lady, but you're coming with me. Jake Miller had learned long ago that life throws curveballs when you least expect them. But finding a half-frozen woman on Highway 9 during the worst blizzard in 20 years? That wasn't a curveball. That was life laughing at him. He'd been driving back from his late shift at Peterson's auto shop. Tommy buckled in beside him after spending the evening with Mrs. Henderson next door. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, and the radio crackled with warnings about road closures and power outages. The woman couldn't have been there long, Jake reasoned as he pulled over. Her skin was pale blue, but her pulse was steady when he checked her wrist. Strange thing was, she didn't look like someone who belonged on this stretch of road. Her coat was pure white cashmere, probably cost more than Jake made in 3 months. And that watch? Even in the dim light, he could see it was expensive. Tommy stirred as Jake lifted the stranger into the truck's cab. Daddy? The boy's voice was thick with sleep, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles. Is she okay? Jake settled the woman between them, cranking up the heat. She was breathing but barely conscious, mumbling words that didn't make sense. Something about meetings and deadlines and people who couldn't find out. Jake exchanged glances with his son in the rearview mirror. Tommy had their mother's eyes, warm brown and too wise for an 8-year-old. We're taking her home, Jake said, putting the truck in drive. The trailer park was only 10 minutes away, but in this weather, it might as well have been 10 hours. The woman's head lolled against Tommy's shoulder, and the boy sat perfectly still, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he moved. Jake had seen that look before. The same careful protectiveness Tommy had shown with injured animals they'd found over the years. Pineview Mobile Home Park wasn't much to look at on a good day. Tonight, with snow piling up against the skirting and Christmas lights flickering in the wind, it looked like the edge of the world. Jake pulled into the narrow driveway beside their double white, a faded blue trailer with a small wooden porch he'd built himself. The woman's breathing had gotten steadier during the drive, but she was still unconscious when he carried her inside. Tommy helped clear the couch, moving aside the puzzle they'd been working on, a 1,000-piece mountain scene that was proving harder than the box suggested. Jake laid the woman down carefully, checking her pulse again. Stronger now, but her skin was still too cold. He sent Tommy to get blankets while he searched her coat pockets for identification. No purse, no wallet, nothing. Just a single business card tucked deep in an inner pocket so water damage the writing was illegible. What's her name, Daddy? Tommy asked, tucking a quilt around the woman's shoulders. It was the quilt his mother had made, the one with tiny blue flowers that matched the curtains. Jake felt that familiar tightness in his chest whenever reminders of Lisa surfaced unexpectedly. She'd been gone 2 years now, but her presence still filled their small home in ways that both comforted and haunted him. I don't know, buddy, Jake said, smoothing the woman's damp hair away from her face. But she's safe now. He made hot chocolate for Tommy and coffee for himself, moving quietly around the narrow kitchen. The woman didn't stir, even when the ancient refrigerator kicked on with its usual mechanical groan. Jake had learned to sleep through that sound, along with the dozen other noises that came with living in a 30-year-old trailer. Around midnight, she opened her eyes. Jake was dozing in the recliner, Tommy long since asleep in his bed, when he heard her voice. Where am I? She sounded confused, disoriented. Jake sat up, studying her face in the dim light from the kitchen. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and sharp features that belonged in a magazine, not his living room. You're safe, Jake said, the same words he'd used with Tommy. I found you on the highway. Do you remember what happened? The woman tried to sit up, wincing as if her head hurt. She looked around the small room, taking in the mismatched furniture and the pile of Tommy's toys in the corner. Her gaze lingered on the Christmas tree, a scraggly pine Jake had cut from behind the grocery store and decorated with handmade ornaments. She pressed her fingertips to her temples. I remember driving. The snow was getting worse and I pulled over to make a call. After that, she shook her head. Nothing. I'm sorry. I don't even remember my name. Jake had heard of trauma causing memory loss, but seeing it was different. The woman looked genuinely frightened, as if she'd woken up in someone else's life. It's okay, Jake said, though he wasn't sure if it was. Memory can come back gradually. The important thing is, you're alive. He stood up, moving to the kitchen to get her some water. I'm Jake Miller. That's my son Tommy. He's asleep in the back room. You're welcome to stay until you remember, until you remember anything. The woman accepted the water gratefully, drinking it slowly. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. She paused, studying Jake's face. You didn't have to stop. Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. He'd done what anyone would do, what he hoped someone would do for Tommy if the situation were reversed. That's how he'd been raised, how Lisa had lived her life. Can't leave someone to freeze, Jake said simply. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. He pulled a spare blanket from the closet and handed it to her. Couch is yours for the night, bathrooms down the hall, kitchen's, you can see the kitchen. The woman smiled for the first time, a real smile that transformed her entire face. Whatever her story was, Jake found himself hoping she'd remember it soon. Morning came with Tommy's voice cutting through the quiet. Daddy, the snow lady's awake. Jake opened his eyes to find his son peering around the doorframe, stage whispering as if volume could wake the dead. The woman, Jake really needed to call her something, was sitting up on the couch, looking more alert than she had the night before. Her color had returned, though she still wore the same confused expression. Good morning, she said to Tommy, who approached cautiously. You must be Tommy. Your father told me about you. Tommy nodded seriously, as if he were meeting visiting royalty. Jake watched the interaction from the kitchen, making breakfast. There was something about the way the woman spoke to Tommy, gentle but direct, treating him like a person rather than a child. Do you remember anything else? Jake asked, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her. She ate slowly as if she were trying to remember how food was supposed to taste. Fragments, she said finally. I remember an argument. Someone was angry with me about something important. And I remember feeling like I had to get away. Tommy perked up at this, his 8-year-old brain latching onto the mystery. Like a adventure story? He asked. Maybe you're a secret agent or a princess in disguise? The woman laughed, a sound that filled the small trailer with unexpected warmth. I don't think I'm a princess, she said, but I suppose we'll find out together. Jake spent the morning making calls. To the sheriff's department, to the hospital, to anyone who might have reported a missing person. No one had. It was as if the woman had simply materialized in the snowstorm, with no past and no one looking for her. That's strange, Deputy Barnes said when Jake called for the third time. Usually someone notices when a person goes missing, especially around Christmas. The woman listened to Jake's phone calls with growing anxiety. What if no one's looking for me? She asked when he hung up. What if I don't have anyone? Jake didn't have an answer for that. He'd grown up in Millbrook, knew every family for 3 counties. But this woman was a complete mystery, and mysteries made him nervous. Tommy, however, was delighted. He appointed himself the woman's guide to their small world, showing her his room, his toys, the pictures of his mother that Jake kept on the mantel. That's Mommy, Tommy explained matter-of-factly. She died when I was 6, but Daddy says she's still watching over us. The woman's face softened as she studied Lisa's photograph. She's beautiful, the woman said quietly. She looks kind. Jake felt that familiar tightness in his chest. Lisa had been kind, almost to a fault. She'd been the type of person who brought casseroles to new neighbors and remembered everyone's birthday. The type of person who would have invited a stranger to stay as long as needed, no questions asked. By afternoon, the woman had chosen a name for herself. Sarah, she said. as if testing how it sounded. "I think my name is Sarah." Jake wasn't sure if she remembered or if she was just tired of being called the woman, but Sarah seemed to fit. She helped with small tasks around the trailer, folding laundry and washing dishes, with the careful attention of someone learning a new skill. Tommy was fascinated by Sarah's obvious unfamiliarity with everyday tasks. "Don't you know how to use a can opener?" he asked, watching her struggle with a can of green beans. Sarah laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent. "I'm apparently not very domestic," she said. "I must have had people who did these things for me." That evening, Jake found Sarah standing on the small porch, looking out at the snow-covered trailer park. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that transformed even the most humble homes into something magical. "It's beautiful," she said when Jake joined her. "I don't think I've ever really noticed snow before. Hard to miss in December," Jake said, though he found himself seeing their neighborhood through Sarah's eyes. The Christmas lights strung between trailers, the smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of laughter from the Reynolds' place where the extended family was gathering. It wasn't much, but it was home. Sarah pulled her borrowed coat tighter around her shoulders. "I keep having this feeling that I'm supposed to be somewhere else, that people are waiting for me." She paused, studying Jake's profile. "But I also feel like I've been running from something for a very long time, and for the first time in as long as I can remember, I'm not running anymore." Jake understood that feeling. After Lisa died, he'd felt like he was constantly moving, trying to stay ahead of the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. It was only when he learned to be still, to let Tommy's laughter and the rhythm of daily life carry him forward, that he'd found peace. "Sometimes stopping is the bravest thing you can do," he said. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and temperatures that actually felt seasonal instead of Arctic. Tommy was beside himself with excitement, convinced that Sarah's presence made this Christmas special. "It's like God sent us a present," he announced over breakfast. "A person present." Sarah smiled at this logic, though Jake noticed she seemed more anxious as the day wore on. The trailer park came alive with holiday preparations. Mrs. Henderson knocked on their door with a plate of cookies and barely concealed curiosity about their houseguest. "Such a lovely girl," she said, studying Sarah with the intensity of a detective. "You have the most refined features, dear. Are you from around here?" Sarah's smile was polite but distant. "I'm not sure where I'm from," she said honestly. Tommy insisted on including Sarah in their Christmas Eve traditions. They watched A Charlie Brown Christmas on the small television, shared a dinner of spaghetti and meatballs, and read the Christmas story from Lisa's old Bible. Sarah listened to everything with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize details, as if she were afraid the memories might disappear. "Do you think I have children?" Sarah asked Jake that evening, while Tommy was getting ready for bed. The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he said carefully. "Do you feel like you do?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't think so. I think I would remember something that important." Tommy emerged from the bathroom in his pajamas, demanding Sarah's attention for the elaborate bedtime ritual that had evolved over the past few days. She read him a story, tucked him in, and listened to his prayers, with the patience of someone who had never been around children but was learning to love it. "God bless Daddy, and God bless Mommy in heaven, and God bless Sarah who isn't lost anymore," Tommy prayed. After Tommy was asleep, Jake and Sarah sat in the living room, watching the colored lights on the Christmas tree blink in slow patterns. The trailer felt different with Sarah there, warmer somehow, more alive. Jake had gotten used to the quiet that came with being alone with Tommy, but Sarah's presence reminded him of what he'd been missing. "I should probably try to find out who I am," Sarah said quietly. "It's not fair to you and Tommy, having a stranger in your home." Jake looked at her, noting the way the Christmas lights reflected in her eyes. "You don't feel like a stranger," he said honestly. "And Tommy's happier than he's been in months." Sarah smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I'm scared of what I might remember," she admitted. "What if I'm not a good person? What if I have responsibilities I've been running from?" Jake had wondered the same thing, the expensive clothes, the way she carried herself, the occasional flash of sharp intelligence when she thought no one was looking, all of it suggested Sarah came from a world very different from his own. "We'll deal with whatever comes," Jake said, though he wasn't sure how. He'd built a simple life in Millbrook, one that revolved around Tommy's needs and his own modest ambitions. Sarah's presence had already begun to change that equilibrium in ways he couldn't fully understand. Christmas morning brought Tommy's excited shouts and the sound of wrapping paper being destroyed with surgical precision. Sarah had somehow managed to buy gifts, despite having no money and no memory. Small things from the dollar store that she'd wrapped in newspaper and decorated with colored pencils. Tommy treasured them, as if they were made of gold. "I got something for you, too," Sarah said, handing Jake a small package. Inside was a simple coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" written in slightly crooked letters. "I made it at the community center," she explained. "Mrs. Henderson told me about the pottery class." Jake held the mug carefully, knowing it would become one of his most prized possessions. They spent the morning building a snowman in the small yard beside their trailer. Sarah's laughter rang out across the park as she and Tommy engaged in a spirited snowball fight with Jake caught in the crossfire. Watching them together, Jake felt a dangerous warmth spreading through his chest. This was what family was supposed to feel like, chaotic and joyful and completely right. But even as Jake allowed himself to enjoy the moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was still hiding something. Not intentionally, perhaps, but there were pieces of her story that didn't fit. The way she instinctively knew which fork to use at dinner, the way she unconsciously corrected Tommy's grammar, the way she seemed to understand complex problems with an ease that suggested extensive education. The first crack in Sarah's memory came 3 days after Christmas. Jake was at work, Tommy was at school, and Sarah was alone in the trailer when she found the newspaper Jake had left on the kitchen table. The headline read, "Local Development Project Faces Community Opposition," and something about the story made her head pound with sudden recognition. Meridian Development Corporation. The name meant something to her, something important. Sarah stared at the article until the words blurred, trying to force the memory to surface. She could almost see it. A boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows, men in expensive suits, her own voice saying words she couldn't quite remember. The phone rang, making her jump, and the moment was lost. "Sarah, you okay?" Jake's voice came through the small speaker, concerned. "You sound strange." Sarah realized she was breathing hard, her hands shaking as she held the phone. "I'm fine," she lied. I think I remembered something, but it's gone now." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Memory's funny that way. It comes back when it's ready." But Sarah wasn't sure she wanted her memory to come back. The fragments that surfaced were sharp-edged and uncomfortable, filled with tension and pressure she didn't understand. In contrast, the simple rhythms of life with Jake and Tommy felt like sanctuary. She'd learned to make pancakes that didn't burn, to braid Tommy's hair for school, to appreciate the small pleasures of a life lived without constant urgency. Tommy came home from school with exciting news. "Mrs. Patterson says you should come to the New Year's Eve party," he announced to Sarah. "Everyone wants to meet you properly." Sarah felt a flutter of panic at the thought of meeting the entire neighborhood. What if someone recognized her? What if her missing life caught up with her before she was ready? "I don't know," Sarah said carefully. "I'm not sure I'm ready for a party." Tommy's face fell with the particular devastation that only 8-year-olds can achieve. "But it'll be fun," he protested. "And Mrs. Henderson is making her famous punch." Jake smiled at his son's logic. "We don't have to stay long," he said to Sarah. "Just show our faces, let Tommy show you off." The party was held in the community center, a low building that served as everything from meeting hall to storm shelter. Sarah helped Tommy hang streamers while Jake set up chairs, and she found herself enjoying the easy camaraderie of neighbors working together. But as more people arrived, she felt increasingly anxious, as if she were wearing a costume that might slip at any moment. "You look nervous," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find a woman about her own age, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes. "I'm Claire Patterson, Tommy's teacher. He talks about you constantly." Sarah smiled, remembering Tommy's stories about his favorite teacher. "He loves your class," Sarah said. "You've made such a difference for him." Claire studied Sarah with the same intensity Mrs. Henderson had shown, but with less obvious curiosity. "He's a special kid," she said. "Jake's done an amazing job with him, especially considering—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Raising a child alone was never easy, especially when grief was involved. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing into the warmth of the community. These were good people, she realized, people who looked out for each other without expecting anything in return. Jake moved through the crowd with easy confidence, stopping to chat with neighbors, checking on elderly residents, making sure everyone felt included. This was his world, and he was clearly respected in it. But as midnight approached, Sarah felt that familiar anxiety returning. "I need some air," she told Jake, stepping outside into the crisp night. The sky was clear, stars visible in a way they never were in— where? The thought slipped away before she could catch it. Jake followed her outside, concern evident in his expression. "You okay?" he asked, though he'd been asking that question a lot lately. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, staring up at the stars. "I keep feeling like I'm living someone else's life," she said quietly. "Like the real me is somewhere else, and I'm just playing pretend." Jake moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "Maybe the real you is exactly who you are right now," he said. "Maybe everything else is just background noise." Sarah looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. Jake Miller was the most honest person she'd ever known, though she couldn't remember knowing anyone else for comparison. "What if I remember and I have to leave?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Then we'll deal with it," he said finally. "But until then, you're here. You're part of our family." The word family hit Sarah with unexpected force. She'd been so focused on her missing past that she hadn't realized she'd been building a present. With Jake and Tommy, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The countdown began inside the community center, voices rising in unison. 10, 9, 8. Sarah looked at Jake, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. 7, 6, 5. Whatever happened next, this moment was real. 4, 3, 2. Jake's hand found hers, warm and steady. 1. Happy New Year. The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative, as if they were both afraid it might break the spell that had brought them together. But it didn't break anything. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing that had happened since Sarah opened her eyes in Jake's trailer. When they broke apart, Sarah saw her own wonder reflected in Jake's expression. "Happy New Year, Sarah," he said softly. "Whoever you are." And for the first time since she'd lost her memory, Sarah didn't want to be anyone else. She wanted to be exactly who she was in this moment, with this man, in this life they'd accidentally built together. But even as Sarah allowed herself to hope, somewhere in the distance, her phone was ringing in a boardroom she couldn't remember, and people in expensive suits were asking questions she couldn't answer. The two worlds she'd been living between were about to collide, and neither Jake nor Sarah was prepared for what that collision would reveal. The first sign of trouble came on January 3rd, when Jake returned from work to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a manila envelope with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she held what appeared to be legal documents. "Sarah?" Jake's voice was careful, the way it got when Tommy was hurt or scared. "What's wrong?" "I remember," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from the papers. "Not everything, but enough." She gestured to the envelope. "This was in the mailbox. It's addressed to me, my real name." Jake felt his stomach drop as he read the return address. Meridian Development Corporation. The same company he'd seen mentioned in the newspaper, the one planning to develop land around Millbrook. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out a thick stack of documents. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm the CEO of Meridian Development." She looked up at Jake, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "And according to these papers, I own the land your trailer sits on. All of it, the entire Pineview Mobile Home Park." Jake sank into the chair across from her, his mind struggling to process this information. The woman who had been living in his home, sharing meals with his son, kissing him under the New Year's stars. She was the corporate enemy he'd been reading about in the local paper. "You're here to tear down our homes," he said, his voice flat with disbelief. "I was," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The documents show I was supposed to finalize the purchase 3 weeks ago. I was driving to Millbrook to oversee the eviction notices when," she gestured vaguely at her head, "when I ended up in that snowbank instead." Jake stared at her, seeing the expensive clothes and refined mannerisms in a completely different light. "Eviction notices," Jake repeated slowly. "You were coming here to kick us out of our homes." Sarah flinched at the harsh reality of his words. "It's not personal, Jake, it's business. The land is worth millions if we develop it properly. Shopping centers, office buildings, upscale housing." She stopped, realizing how hollow the justification sounded. Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the small window that overlooked the trailer park. Outside, he could see Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry, the Reynolds children playing in the snow, old Mr. Garcia sitting on his porch despite the cold. These weren't just houses to be bulldozed. They were homes, filled with people who'd lived here for decades. "How long have you been planning this?" Jake asked, his back still to her. Sarah consulted the documents with the careful attention of someone trying to piece together her own life. "According to these files, about 2 years, we've been quietly buying up properties, waiting for the right moment to make our move." 2 years, right around the time Lisa died, when Jake was too consumed with grief to notice corporate vultures circling his neighborhood. "And you don't remember any of this?" Jake turned back to face her, searching her expression for signs of deception. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, her professional composure cracking. "I remember fragments now. Board meetings, profit projections, lawyers talking about necessary relocations, but I don't remember feeling anything about it. It was just numbers on spreadsheets." Tommy's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Daddy, why do you look mad?" He stood in the doorway, still wearing his school backpack, his young face scrunched with confusion. Jake and Sarah exchanged a look of mutual panic. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his surrogate mother figure is actually the destroyer of his world? "We're just talking about grown-up stuff, buddy," Jake said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Why don't you go start your homework?" Tommy looked between them suspiciously, the way children do when they sense adult secrets. "Is Sarah leaving?" he asked directly. The question hung in the air like a live wire. Sarah knelt down to Tommy's level, her voice gentle despite the chaos in her eyes. "I might have to go away for a while," she said carefully. "There are some things I need to figure out about my life before I lost my memory." Tommy's face crumpled with the particular devastation of a child who'd already lost one mother. "But you just got here," Tommy protested, "and you're learning to make pancakes, right? And we were going to build a treehouse in spring." His voice trailed off as he realized the adults couldn't promise him anything. Jake knelt beside Sarah, pulling his son into a hug that was as much for his own comfort as Tommy's. "Sometimes things change, son," Jake said quietly, "but that doesn't mean they're not real while they're happening." Tommy buried his face in Jake's shoulder, and Sarah had to look away from the pain she'd caused. After a moment, Tommy pulled back and looked at Sarah with eyes that were far too old for his age. "Are you a bad person?" Tommy asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think I might be." Tommy considered this with the seriousness of a judge, then reached out and took Sarah's hand. "Daddy says people aren't good or bad, they just make good or bad choices," Tommy said solemnly. "So you can choose to be good." Sarah squeezed his small hand, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of a child who'd learned too early that life was complicated and unfair. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, Jake and Sarah sat in the living room like strangers. The easy intimacy they'd built over the past weeks had evaporated, replaced by the reality of their impossible situation. Sarah had changed back into her original clothes, the expensive white coat and designer jeans that marked her as an outsider in their world. "I have to go back," Sarah said finally. "My assistant, my board of directors, everyone's been looking for me. The longer I stay missing, the more complicated this becomes." Jake nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to ask her to stay. "What happens to us? To the trailer park?" Sarah stared at the documents spread across the coffee table. "I don't know. The contracts are already signed, the investors are expecting returns. Even if I wanted to stop it," she shrugged helplessly. "I'm just one person against an entire corporation, and legally, I'm bound by fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value." "Fiduciary duty," Jake repeated with bitter humor. "Fancy words for greed." Sarah flinched at the accusation, but she didn't deny it. "It's not that simple, Jake. There are hundreds of people employed by Meridian, pension funds invested in our projects, communities that benefit from our development." "What about this community?" Jake interrupted. "What about Mrs. Henderson, who's lived here for 30 years? What about the Garcia family who can't afford to move anywhere else? What about Tommy, who's finally happy again after losing his mother?" Sarah's tears came harder now, but Jake found he didn't care. The woman he'd fallen in love with was disappearing, replaced by a corporate executive who spoke in buzzwords and bottom lines. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, though they both knew sorry wouldn't rebuild the homes she planned to destroy. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you or Tommy." Jake stood up, suddenly exhausted by the weight of betrayal. "But you're going to anyway," he said. "Because that's who you really are." Sarah looked up at him, her mascara smudged, her perfect composure completely shattered. "Is it?" she asked desperately. "Because for the past 3 weeks, I've been someone completely different. I've been happy, Jake. For the first time in my life, I've been genuinely happy. Doesn't that count for something?" Jake wanted to say yes, wanted to forgive her everything because of the woman she'd been in his home. But he thought about Tommy's face, about the neighbors who trusted him, about the life he'd built in the ruins of his grief. "It counts," he said quietly, "but it's not enough." The next morning, Sarah was gone. She'd left early, while Jake was at work and Tommy was at school, taking nothing but the clothes she'd arrived in. The only sign she'd been there was a note on the kitchen table and the coffee mug she'd made him for Christmas, carefully washed and placed beside the sink. The note was brief. "Jake, I'm sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have. I need to figure out who I really am and what I'm capable of. Take care of Tommy. Take care of yourself. I'll try to make this right somehow. Sarah." Jake crumpled the note and threw it away, then immediately retrieved it and smoothed it out. Even angry, he couldn't bring himself to destroy her words. Tommy took the news of Sarah's departure with the stoic acceptance of a child who'd learned that people leave. "Is she coming back?" he asked over dinner, pushing his macaroni around his plate. Jake wished he could lie, wished he could promise his son that fairy tales sometimes came true. "I don't know, buddy," he said instead. "I hope so," but hope felt dangerous now. Jake had allowed himself to believe in second chances, in the possibility that loneliness wasn't his permanent fate. Sarah's presence had awakened something in him that he'd thought died with Lisa. The capacity for joy, for partnership, for a future that extended beyond simple survival. Now that future felt as fragile as the coffee mug sitting on his kitchen counter. The eviction notices arrived a week later, delivered by a process server, who apologized for the timing, but explained he was just doing his job. Jake stared at the legal documents, seeing Sarah's signature at the bottom of pages that would destroy everything he'd built. The corporate letterhead was crisp and professional, a stark contrast to the messy humanity of the lives it was about to disrupt. 30 days. That's all they had to find new homes, pack up their lives, and disappear so that Meridian Development could transform their neighborhood into something more profitable. Jake walked through the trailer park, watching his neighbors grapple with the same impossible reality. Mrs. Henderson sat on her porch, reading her notice with the stunned expression of someone who'd been punched without warning. "What are we going to do?" she asked Jake, her voice small and frightened. Jake had no answer. At 58, with arthritis and a fixed income, Mrs. Henderson couldn't easily start over somewhere else. The trailer park wasn't just her home. It was her entire world. The community meeting that night was standing room only, filled with families who'd just learned they were about to become homeless. Jake found himself at the front of the room, not because he'd asked to be there, but because people expected him to have answers. He'd been the one to organize neighborhood watch, to coordinate snow removal, to be the unofficial leader when leadership was needed. "We can fight this," said Claire Patterson, Tommy's teacher. "There are laws about adequate notice, about relocation assistance." But even as she spoke, Jake could see the defeat in her eyes. They all knew the truth. Corporations like Meridian had lawyers and resources that people like them couldn't match. The fight was already over before it began. "Maybe we should just take whatever they're offering," suggested Bob Reynolds, a man in his 70s who'd raised 4 children in the trailer park. "Cut our losses and move on." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, the weary acceptance of people who'd learned that life rarely gave them choices. But Jake couldn't accept defeat, not when he thought about Tommy's face, about the life they'd built in their small home. "This is our community," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "These are our homes. We don't just roll over because some corporation decides we're inconvenient." The crowd stirred, responding to his passion, even as they doubted his optimism. "What do you suggest?" asked Mrs. Henderson. "We can't exactly outbid Meridian Development." Jake had been thinking about that question since the notices arrived. "We make it expensive for them," he said. "We make it public. We make it a story that costs them more than just money." And so began the battle for Pineview Mobile Home Park. Jake organized protests, contacted local media, reached out to every advocacy group he could find. The story of the small community fighting corporate development resonated with people who'd never heard of Millbrook, and suddenly their little trailer park became a symbol.